The resurrection happened, the threshold crossed, the portal passed, and you woke up this morning in the same body, with the same patterns running, the same habitual thoughts beginning to assemble themselves in the same sequence they did the morning before. And nobody told you that this is not a sign that nothing changed. It is the precise mechanism by which everything that changed will either solidify into new architecture or quietly dissolve back into what it was before. Here is the detail that almost never makes it into the conventional telling of the post-resurrection narrative. After the event that changed everything, after the empty tomb, after the first appearances, after the reports that spread through the community with the force of something that could not be undone, Peter stood up and made an announcement. He said, "I am going fishing." And the others, without hesitation, without debate, without asking whether this made any sense given what had just happened, said, "We'll come with you." They went out. They fished through the night. They caught nothing. That is the line that deserves the most attention. That is not a story about men who lacked conviction. That is a precise description of what happens neurologically and psychologically in the hours after the peak of a significant experience passes. The nervous system, having operated at maximum intensity, begins its default recovery process. And the default recovery process is not neutral. It is a return to the most established behavioral pattern available. The patterns that existed before the peak are deeper than the ones that formed during it. They have years, sometimes decades, of repetition behind them. When the emotional intensity drops, those patterns reactivate. Before we go into what that means practically and what to do about it, if this kind of knowledge speaks to you, subscribe to this channel. This is where we keep building on this work, threshold by threshold, layer by layer. Why does this happen specifically in the hours after the peak and not during it? Because during the peak, the neurochemical cascade of the experience suppresses the default pattern. The full activation of the heightened state, the dopamine, the norepinephrine, the entire hormonal signature of an event that doesn't usually happen, creates a neurological environment where new associations form rapidly and feel both accessible and inevitable. But when that cascade ends, as it always must, the older, more established neural architecture begins to reassert its gravitational pull. The experience passes, the deeper structure remains, and the brain, without deliberate direction, begins the work of restoring what it knows. Something in you may already recognize this pattern from your own experience. The resolution that felt structurally unbreakable in the moment it formed, until the intensity of the moment that produced it faded, and the familiar reasserted itself. The shift that was absolutely real when it happened and looked different from the outside 3 days later, once the ordinary life had reassembled itself around you. You were not imagining the original moment. What you were experiencing in the days that followed is the precise thing we are mapping right now. The post-peak reversion, operating silently without announcing itself under the appearance of simply returning to normal. The period you are inside right now has a specific name in memory research. It is called the post-experience consolidation window. Studies on memory formation and neural plasticity consistently show that the 24 to 72 hours following a significant experience are the period of maximum neurological openness, the interval when new patterns are most readily consolidated and, without deliberate anchoring, most easily lost. The popular understanding of transformation tends to treat the peak moment as the critical event. The tradition that actually studied transformation cycles across centuries understood the opposite. The peak opens the possibility. The day after installs it, or it doesn't. There is a specific mechanism behind this worth understanding clearly. After an intense experience, the brain enters a state where synaptic plasticity, The ease with which neural connections are strengthened or rewritten is at its highest. Long-term potentiation, the process by which repeated activation of synaptic connections makes them more efficient, is particularly responsive in the hours following a peak state. The same mechanism that allows trauma to become structurally embedded also allows transformation to become structural. The brain is doing one of two things in this window: consolidating the new pattern or restoring the old one. Without deliberate direction, it defaults to what it already knows. The tomb is empty. That fact is not in dispute. The stone has been moved. The old structure is gone. What was inside it has walked out. And the mind, your mind specifically this morning, April 6th, is still processing through the categories it had before the threshold. Not out of weakness or lack of sincerity, because the update hasn't been installed yet, because the day after work hasn't happened. The new is available. The old operating system is still running. What you do in the next several hours determines which one consolidates. If what we're covering here is landing for you as more than historical curiosity, write in the comments right now, "I exit the old framework," not as a declaration of having arrived somewhere completely new, as an acknowledgement that the old story is not the only operating system available today. On the day of the resurrection itself, 2 of the disciples were walking to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. Someone joined them on the road. He walked beside them the entire journey, engaged with their questions, offered perspective, was present and available throughout the walk. They arrived at the village, sat down for a meal together, and only when he broke the bread did they recognize who had been walking beside them the whole time. The new was present throughout every mile of the walk. Their processing framework hadn't updated. The mind they brought into the journey was still governed by the categories of what came before. That story is uncomfortable to sit with, honestly. A transformation of that scale had occurred. The proof was walking directly beside them, speaking directly to them, for hours. And 2 people who genuinely wanted it to be true were unable to perceive it. Not because they were dishonest, not because they were spiritually inadequate, but because the mental model active in their processing was the one formed before the threshold. The new was present. The old categories kept filtering it out. The framework determines what the mind is capable of receiving, regardless of what is actually in the room. Thomas was not present on the day of the first consolidation window. By the time he heard about it, several days had passed. The initial window, the period of maximum plasticity, when the encounter with the new reality could have been absorbed directly and embedded without extraordinary proof, had closed. When he heard the report from the others, his response was structurally predictable. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, unless I put my finger where the nails were, I will not believe. Not arrogance, not a failure of faith. The behavior of a mind that missed the initial window and now requires a second opening at greater cost to access what the first window would have made available naturally. These are not stories about the people who lack devotion. They are precise, detailed accounts of how consciousness operates in the hours and days after a major threshold is crossed. The post-peak reversion is not a moral event. It is a structural one. The question is not whether it will happen. It will. The question is whether you are going to work with the window consciously or let the default process complete without your participation. The Eastern Orthodox tradition preserved an understanding that the Western calendar largely abandoned. The day after Easter, what the Orthodox Church calls Bright Monday, is not treated as the beginning of ordinary time. It is treated as the continuation of the feast, with liturgical language that is specific about what the day carries. The official term for the entire week following Easter in the Orthodox calendar is Bright Week. Bright Monday opens it with a clear theological position. Sunday was the portal. Monday is when the new life begins to be lived, not merely witnessed. The tradition understood that the threshold doesn't complete at the crossing. The crossing begins something that requires deliberate inhabiting on the day that follows. If this is opening something in you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this work at exactly the right moment. The Jewish tradition surrounding Passover tells the same story through a different structure. The days following the Seder night are not a gradual wind down from a peak moment back to ordinary time. They are a deliberate consolidation period, with specific practices prescribed for each of the 8 days that follow, built on the understanding that the night of liberation required days of embedding. The Israelites who, years later in the wilderness, began expressing a desire to return to Egypt were not people who had forgotten that they had been enslaved. They were people who had not completed the consolidation of the new identity. The longing for the familiar, even when the familiar was bondage, is the post-peak reversion in its most historically documented and most instructive form. The Kybalion addresses this directly, and in terms that are specifically relevant to the window you are inside right now. The fifth of the 7 Hermetic principles is the law of rhythm. Everything flows, everything swings, every advance is followed by a retreat. The pendulum swings in both directions. Most expositions of this principle treat it as a description to accept. But the Kybalion contains a second teaching that almost never gets cited alongside the first, and it is the operative teaching for today specifically. The master of the law of rhythm is not the person who accepts the swing. It is the person who learns to work with the law at a more precise level than mere acceptance. What does working with the law of rhythm at a more precise level mean in practice? The Kybalion states it clearly. The master polarizes at the point they wish to remain, and then neutralizes the rhythmic swing of the pendulum that would tend to carry them to the other pole. The swing can be held at the high point, not indefinitely, but long enough to establish a new equilibrium before the return pressure builds to its full strength. The mechanism for holding it is not resistance or willpower. It is a specific, deliberate act of anchoring performed at the precise moment of maximum plasticity, which is the window you are inside right now. The initiation practices of the ancient mystery schools, both the Egyptian traditions and the Pythagorean school at Croton, built a specific day-after protocol into their initiation structure. The initiatory event itself was the threshold crossing, the moment of rupture between the old self and the new. But the day that followed was treated as the anchoring period, and it was treated as seriously as the initiation itself. The newly initiated were not returned immediately to ordinary life. They were held in a structured environment specifically designed to prevent the default regression that the teachers had observed in every initiation cycle, the pullback toward familiar identity that activated precisely when the intensity of the threshold event began to fade. What those ancient practitioners were doing, without the vocabulary of neuroscience, but with centuries of careful observation of human behavior after initiation, corresponds precisely to what modern memory consolidation research calls the critical encoding window. They were not performing arbitrary ceremony. They were applying an empirically developed protocol for the specific neurological state that follows a peak initiation experience. The vocabulary is different. The window is the same, and the practical prescription they arrived at across traditions that had no contact with each other points to the same 4 specific actions. If you've been studying these principles and still feel like something is blocking the shift from understanding to lived reality, like there's a gap between the knowledge and the actual structural change, I left something for you in the first pinned comment below. It's for those who are ready to make the consolidation real. Here is the practical distinction between the person who consolidates after a threshold and the person who drifts back. It is not intention. Both have intention. It is not belief. Both believe something happened. It is not intelligence or sincerity, or the depth of the original experience. The distinction is specific, deliberate action taken in the first hours of the day after, action that gives the nervous system the direction it needs to consolidate the new pattern rather than restore the default one. The 4 practices that follow are not a spiritual regimen. They are targeted actions for the specific window that is open right now. The first practice, and this is the most important one to complete before noon today, is to write a single declaration in the present tense. Not what you want, not what you are working toward, who you now are, as of today, after the threshold you crossed. 1 sentence. I am kak. The blank is specific to the transformation the threshold carried, not aspirational, not future-facing, present. The person you are after this threshold, stated as current fact. Write it by hand, on paper. The motor engagement of handwriting activates consolidation pathways that typing does not. This is not esoteric. This is how memory encoding research describes the difference between writing modalities. What makes the declaration effective is not how eloquent it sounds. Specificity is the variable. I am better registers as too diffuse for the brain to build behavioral consistency around. It has no edges, no reference point. I am someone who acts from the new orientation rather than the weight of the old one. That is specific enough to generate a neural signature the brain can use. The declaration doesn't need to be poetic. It needs to be true, present, and specific enough to distinguish the new identity from the previous one in at least one concrete dimension that affects how decisions get made. You already know what the declaration is. You don't need to spend a long time deciding. The mind that has crossed a genuine threshold knows what changed. The hesitation is not uncertainty. It is the voice of the old identity, which is well established, articulate, and very skilled at suggesting that the declaration is premature, that you don't have enough evidence yet, that you should wait until you feel more certain. That voice is the pendulum beginning its return swing. It always sounds reasonable. Write the declaration before that voice finishes its argument. There is a distinction worth making here between what the declaration reveals and what feeling ready requires. The declaration does not require you to feel ready. It does not require you to have fully processed the threshold, to have arrived at perfect clarity, to feel the new identity as fully installed. It requires only that you can name one true thing about who you are after the threshold that was not as accessible before it. One true thing stated in the present. That is the entire scope of the practice. The feeling of readiness is a state the old identity will withhold indefinitely. The declaration is an act the new identity can take from exactly where you are right now. The Egyptian initiates at the temple schools were required, the morning after the threshold rite, to speak their new initiatory name aloud. The name that corresponded to the person they were after the initiation, not before it. The speaking was not symbolic ceremony. It was an act of claiming the new identity in a form the nervous system could process as current reality rather than future aspiration. The ancient teachers understood through generations of observed initiation cycles what the neuroscience of embodied cognition is now quantifying. Articulating something in the present tense with full physical engagement registers in the brain differently than thinking it. The new identity needs to be spoken or written to begin establishing its neural anchor. After you write the declaration, do one specific thing. Read it aloud, not as a recitation, as an announcement to yourself. The combination of writing by hand and speaking aloud activates a third consolidation pathway. auditory processing, that gives the new identity three separate neural entry points simultaneously. Writing engages the motor cortex and the visual processing stream. Speaking engages the auditory cortex. When all three are activated around the same declarative content, the encoding is more redundant, which means it is harder for the default pattern to overwrite it in the hours that follow. The ancient morning practices knew this experientially. The neuroscience confirms it mechanically. Do both of these, write and speak, before you open your phone, before you engage with anyone else's agenda for the day, before the ordinary morning loads its usual demands. The consolidation window is most effective in the first moments of waking consciousness, when the brain is still in the transitional state between the processed information of sleep and the full activation of the day's operating context. Ancient initiatory practices almost universally prescribed their morning practices in this specific window, not because of mystical hour significance, but because the teachers observed that what entered consciousness in those first moments tended to set the character of the entire day. Write it, speak it, then let the day begin. Let the day. The second practice builds directly on the first. Take one deliberate act before noon today that the old identity would not have taken. Not a large act, not a dramatic announcement or a life restructuring decision. A precise, specific, small act that is consistent with the person described in the declaration and inconsistent with the habitual behavioral pattern before the threshold. The size of the act is not the determining variable. The alignment is. A small, aligned act before noon carries more consolidating weight than a large aspirational plan organized for some time later in the week. Why before noon, specifically? The cortisol awakening response, the natural hormonal peak that occurs in the first 90 minutes after waking, creates a neurological context for daily orienting. What you do in that window tends to establish the operating identity reference point for the rest of the day. Ancient traditions that prescribed dawn practices were encoding this observation through centuries of behavioral pattern recognition. The hour is not inherently magical. The neurochemical state it corresponds to is functionally real. What you do with your first deliberate act sets the reference point the rest of the day organizes around. You've probably noticed this dynamic in your own mornings. A morning where the first act was genuinely deliberate, chosen rather than automatic, tends to produce a day where deliberate acts are more accessible. A morning where the first act was reflexive and habitual tends to pull the entire day toward the reflexive and habitual. Today, that first deliberate act needs to be the act of the new person, not an announcement to anyone, a private act, a different response, a choice made from the new orientation rather than the old one that tells your own nervous system. This is who we are now. We act from here. What counts as a qualifying deliberate act? It can be this small, sending the message you've been postponing from the new position rather than the old one. Beginning the day in the space that corresponds to the new identity. Making the one decision that the pre-threshold version of you would have deferred or autopiloted. The question to ask is simple. What would the person in the declaration do this morning that I, before the threshold, would not have done? Find that specific thing. Do it before noon. The act is not about results. The act is about giving the nervous system behavioral data that is consistent with the declaration. The brain updates its model of who you are through what you do, not through what you intend. What makes an act genuinely deliberate rather than merely performative is this. The act must produce some form of internal friction, not pain or difficulty necessarily, but the small resistance that comes from acting in a way that the old pattern would not have acted. That friction is the neurological signal that the new pattern is being exercised rather than the old one. Without friction, the act may feel aligned, but is not actually generating new behavioral data for the brain to encode. The presence of small friction, the slight discomfort of acting as the new person before the new person is fully established, is how you know the practice is working. The friction does not mean the act is wrong. It means the act is real. The old identity produces friction precisely when the new one is successfully overriding it. If the act feels completely natural and effortless and entirely consistent with who you've always been, that act is not the one. The qualifying act is the one that feels slightly strange, slightly ahead of where you are, slightly like playing a role that hasn't fully become yours yet. That strangeness is the gap closing. The brain encodes it as evidence that the new identity is operative, and the gap between the aspired self and the operating self narrows by precisely the amount of strangeness you were willing to act through. The third practice is the one the alchemical tradition treated as the most critical component of post-initiation consolidation, and the least intuitive in a culture that rewards public announcement of growth. The instruction is this: do not share the new state yet. For the next 72 hours, keep the declaration and the deliberate acts private while the root establishes itself below the surface. Not secret permanently, private for now. This is not about hiding your transformation. It is about protecting the specific neurological condition that allows the root to go deep before the world begins engaging with it. Why does sharing too early collapse the consolidation window? Because every relationship you currently have is calibrated to the person who existed before the threshold. The people who care about you will, without any intention to undermine, reflect the familiar version of you back in every interaction, in their tone, in the assumptions they make about what you need, in the questions that feel natural to ask. If the new identity doesn't have a root yet, that reflection lands on unstable ground and activates the pull toward the familiar identity. The new state begins explaining itself before it has solidified enough to simply be itself. The alchemical instruction to keep the work in the sealed vessel, to not open the lid before the transformation has stabilized, is this observation encoded in metaphorical language. The seal is not secrecy for its own sake. The seal creates the container within which the new state can consolidate without external interference. The initiates who underwent the threshold rites at the mystery schools were held in structured environments for a specific period because the teachers had observed across generations what happened when the newly initiated were returned too quickly to their social context. The transformation leaked back into the social equilibrium it had disrupted, and the work had to be repeated. 72 hours, that is the window for private consolidation. Not years, not months, 3 days before the new identity has enough structural depth to engage with external reflection without being moved by it. 3 days appears across the traditions that studied post-threshold periods most carefully as the minimum consolidation interval for an identity-level shift to become stable enough to withstand the pressure of the social environment that was built around the previous identity. After 3 days, the sharing can happen from a root that can hold its own. What does engaging with the world look like during those 72 hours? Not differently from the outside. You show up, you fulfill your obligations, you interact. The difference is internal. You don't seek feedback on the new identity. You don't announce it, test it against others' reactions, or ask for their assessment of whether the threshold was real. You act from it quietly. You let the declaration and the deliberate acts do their work below the surface. In the alchemical language, the work happens in the sealed vessel, the vessel being your own private interior, maintained deliberately while the external world proceeds as if nothing particular has changed. 3 days of that, and the root is down. The fourth practice is the most overlooked element of post-threshold consolidation, and the most direct physical intervention available right now. Address the body. The old identity is stored not only in memory and behavioral habit, but in the body itself, in the habitual posture, the default breath pattern, the quality and location of muscle tension. The mind updates faster than the body. If the body continues to carry the somatic signature of the old identity, it keeps sending the old signal to the brain's identity processing systems. The body is the last to update, and updating it deliberately in the consolidation window accelerates the entire anchoring process. Here's the practice. Take 30 seconds right now and notice how your body is positioned, the posture, the quality of the breath, the location of any tension. Then ask one question. How does the person in the declaration carry themselves? Not as an idealized vision, as a practical physical description. What is the posture? What is the breath pattern? Shift your physical position to match that description. Hold it for 2 minutes. This is what the neuroscience of embodied cognition describes, the documented, reproducible, bidirectional relationship between somatic state and psychological state. The body signals the brain reads the body. Updating the signal updates the reading, and the reading updates the signal back. These 4 practices together, the written and spoken present tense declaration, the 1 deliberate act before noon, the 72 hours of protected consolidation, the 2-minute somatic calibration, are not a spiritual regimen requiring a particular belief system. They are a precise, time-sensitive set of actions targeted at the specific neurological window that is open right now. The ancient traditions that preserved these practices in different forms were observing the same human pattern across different cultural frameworks, what they called anchoring, aligning, or sealing. Memory research calls consolidation encoding. The vocabulary changes, the window is the same window. The sequence matters. Write the declaration first before the deliberate act. Speak it aloud directly after writing it, before any other engagement. Take the deliberate act within the next 2 hours, before the morning has fully loaded its ordinary demands. Do the somatic calibration after the act, as a way of confirming in the body what the declaration and the act have begun encoding in the mind. Begin the 72-hour protection period from the moment you take the deliberate act. This sequence mirrors what the mystery school protocols prescribed, though they described it in the language of their respective traditions rather than the language of neuroscience. The structure underneath the language is the same: write, speak, act, calibrate, protect. In that order, in that window today. There is a hermetic dimension to this that the neurological framing alone doesn't fully capture. The law of correspondence, as above, so below, as below, so above, runs in both directions and across all scales. The astronomical convergence that generated yesterday's threshold also amplifies today's consolidation window. This is not a claim that the planets perform the anchoring for you. It is an observation, consistent with what ancient practitioners mapped across centuries of careful cycle tracking, that certain configurations of cosmological forces correspond with periods of unusual human plasticity. What gets anchored in this specific window, during the Easter threshold at the intersection of lunation and equinox, in the week of the Neptune-Aries ingress, goes deeper than what a different 48 hours would reach. The connection to the 40-day window from yesterday's April 5th video is direct and structural. The portal was April 5. The anchor is April 6th. What grows in the 40 days that follow depends entirely on the quality of the route established today. If today passes as ordinary time, if the morning completes without the declaration, the deliberate act, the protected consolidation, the 40-day window still exists. But it begins with the default identity operating, not the transformed one. The difference between a 40-day window rooted in the new and one rooted in the unchanged default is the difference between a seed planted in prepared ground and a seed dropped on concrete. Both windows exist, only one produces a harvest in proportion to the threshold that opened it. What does the 40-day window look like if the anchor is set correctly today? In week 1, the change is subtle, not visible to anyone around you, not dramatically felt even by you. What changes is specific. In week 2, a different decision gets made automatically, without internal negotiation, in a situation that would previously have produced the old default response, not because you are trying harder, because the decision is now consistent with who you structurally are. The effort that the old decision used to require is simply absent, and that absence is how you know the consolidation has taken root at the structural level, not merely the aspirational one. In weeks 3 and 4, the new pattern begins to generate its own evidence. Opportunities that were not visible before become visible, not because the external world changed, but because the perceptual filter changed. What the Hermetic tradition calls the law of correspondence, the inner restructuring becomes legible in the outer world. You begin to notice what was always there, but was filtered out by the old framework. This is the practical meaning of as within, so without in operation, not as a cosmological metaphor, but as a description of how perception works when the operating identity has genuinely updated. The paradox of this evidence is worth noting. You will not know whether the outer world changes you notice in weeks 3 and 4 are caused by your inner change or simply perceived differently because of it. The Hermetic tradition does not resolve this paradox. It treats it as irrelevant. The law of correspondence does not distinguish between you changed so you attracted different things and you changed so you now perceive the things that were always there. Both are true at different levels. The practical result is the same. The outer world looks different, not because it performed for you, but because the filter through which you perceive it has been updated at the structural level, and a different filter produces a different world. There is a specific marker for whether today's work has taken root, and it becomes visible in approximately 3 weeks. The marker is not how you feel. It is what decision you make differently, automatically, without internal negotiation, in a situation that would previously have produced the old default response. Write down the situation right now. Write down the old default response. Check in 3 weeks. If the anchoring worked, the response will have changed, not as aspiration, as behavior, as what simply occurs to you to do when the situation presents itself, before the old pattern has time to suggest its alternative. There is a specific marker for whether today's work has taken root, and it becomes visible in approximately 3 weeks. The marker is not how you feel. It is what decision you make differently, automatically, without internal negotiation, in a situation that would previously have produced the old default response. Write down the situation right now. Write down the old default response. Check in 3 weeks. If the anchoring worked, the response will have changed, not as aspiration, as behavior, as what simply occurs to you to do when the situation presents itself, before the old pattern has time to suggest its alternative. That is the only test worth tracking. Most expositions of post-threshold practice focus on how people should feel or what they should believe during the consolidation period. The tradition that studied these cycles most carefully focused on behavior, not on whether the person felt aligned with the new identity. Feeling alignment is available to both the consolidating and the reverting person in week 1, because the memory of the peak experience is still active, but on whether the person was taking specific, aligned actions that give the nervous system new behavioral data to encode. The anchor is not an emotional state. The anchor is an action. Actions are how the brain updates its model of who you are. The old identity will not argue against the transformation. It is more subtle than that. It will argue for postponement, for preparation, for waiting until conditions are more suitable, until you understand it better, until you've had more time to integrate fully. It will suggest that the declaration might be premature. What if there's more to absorb before you state it as present fact? These objections do not sound like resistance. They sound like wisdom. The old identity has been in operation for years, and it knows how to sound like good judgment. It has one functional goal in this window: move you past the 48 hours without the anchor. After that, the window closes, and the default consolidation completes on its own terms. Here is a mechanical description of what happens if today passes without deliberate anchoring, not as a warning, but as a prediction based on the observed pattern. Over the next 48 to 72 hours, the brain completes its default consolidation process. It keeps what is most consistent with the existing identity architecture. The peak experience gets encoded as a significant memory, real, meaningful, perhaps deeply important. But the structural change, the change in who you are at the level of automatic behavior, of default decision, of baseline operating identity, does not take root. Peter goes back to fishing. The boats are familiar. The lake doesn't ask questions about the resurrection. The disciples did eventually consolidate, but it required 40 more days of continued direct encounter, specific teaching, deliberate practice, sustained exposure to the new reality during a period when the old one was still actively competing for dominance. 40 days before the ascension, then another 10 days of structured waiting. 50 days total before what the tradition calls Pentecost, the point at which the transformation became fully, structurally operational in a way the disciples could carry and transmit without continued reinforcement. 50 days is a long consolidation path. The 4 practices of today represent the short path. The short path is available right now in this specific window. The window, the written and spoken declaration, the one deliberate act before noon, the 72 hours of protected consolidation, the 2-minute posture calibration. That is what Bright Monday was encoding. That is what the day after Passover was built around. That is what the Kybalion pointed toward when it said the Master holds the pendulum at the point they wish to rest. That is what the ancient initiation schools structured their day-after protocols to accomplish. Everything that has been covered in this video converges on the same practical instruction. Today, this morning, before the window closes. The cosmological frame adds one final observation worth naming: the specific convergence of forces that created this threshold, the Neptune ingress into Aries during the week of the Easter threshold, at the intersection of lunation and equinox, has not existed in this form since the 1860s. The ancient practitioners who tracked both the astronomical configurations and the corresponding human patterns understood that certain windows, when they open at a depth that ordinary time cannot reach. What gets rooted in this specific window gets rooted at a depth commensurate with the window that made it available. That is not a promise. It is a description of how the hermetic principle of correspondence operates when the above and the below are aligned. Those who studied the mechanics of transformation across centuries, from the Egyptian temple schools to the Pythagorean communities, to the earliest observance traditions that preserved the resurrection narrative in its operational form, all arrived at the same practical conclusion through independent observation. The threshold is not the culmination. The threshold is the opening. The day after is the work that determines whether the opening becomes a door or remains a memory of a moment when it could have. What consistently distinguished the people who underwent transformation that held whose lives show, in the historical record and in documented observational accounts, a clear structural before and after, was not the intensity of the threshold experience. The disciples who witnessed the resurrection directly included people who went back to fishing and people who didn't. The intensity was identical for all of them. What differed was the anchoring practice in the days that followed. The fisherman's return is documented. So is the eventual consolidation of those who didn't return to fishing, which required 50 days and a second intervention. The anchor is available today. The 50-day path is available as the alternative. The tomb is empty. The old structure is gone. What was inside it has walked out. The question April 6th asks is a different one from the question April 5 asked. What does the person standing outside the empty tomb do with the next 24 hours? Do they register the fact and return to what's familiar? Do they go fishing? Or do they take the 4 specific actions that make the fact of the empty tomb become the new ground they are standing on, structurally, in a way that is still true 3 weeks from now, when the emotional resonance of this threshold has faded into ordinary time? There is a quality to this specific morning that those who understood post-threshold periods described carefully. Not because the morning is inherently magical, but because of what the human nervous system is doing inside it. The specific state of heightened plasticity, of available encoding that follows a genuine threshold crossing. The initiates who had been prepared for this morning understood what it carried and used it with precision. The ones who were not prepared went to the tomb expecting the old reality, found it empty, and because they had no framework for what an empty tomb means, they didn't know what to do with the morning they were standing inside. You are inside this morning right now. The window is not tomorrow. The window is the specific neurological period following the specific threshold that the specific convergence of this week created. You found this content today, inside that window. Whether you explain that through the law of correspondence, through synchronicity, through the algorithm, or through timing that seems more intentional than random, the functional result is identical. You're here with the map in the window. What you do with that is the practice. The culture around you will not mark today as significant. The calendar says it is a Monday. The stores are open. The news cycle continues uninterrupted. The knowledge that this morning is the operative consolidation window has been largely lost from the accessible popular tradition, preserved in fragments scattered across the Orthodox liturgy, the structure of the Passover 8 days, the initiation protocols of the mystery schools, the Hermetic teaching on neutralizing the rhythmic swing. You are holding several of those fragments right now. What you do with them is what separates the 2 people who leave this video. The post-peak collapse operates as a mechanic even when you can see it operating. Knowing about it is not the same as overriding it. The knowing is cognitive, and it updates quickly. You now understand the window, the mechanism, the 4 practices. The doing requires something different, an override of the gravitational pull toward the familiar at the precise moment when that pull is at its strongest. That moment is now, not in an hour when it might feel more convenient. Not later this afternoon. The window is open right now, and the pull toward the familiar is operating right now. And the decision about which one determines what consolidates gets made in the next few minutes. 2 people will leave this video today. One will carry a genuine recognition of everything we've covered, will feel the accuracy of it, will believe it, will perhaps even feel moved by it, and will return to their day without taking the specific actions. The post-peak collapse will complete its default process for that person quietly, without drama, and without that person fully noticing until 3 weeks have passed and the familiar patterns are fully restored. The second person closes the video and immediately writes the declaration, speaks it aloud, takes the one deliberate act, protects the root for 72 hours, holds the posture for 2 minutes, The difference between these two people is not spiritual capacity. It is a single decision made inside the window, before the window closes. The window is not the experience of certainty. The window is not waiting until the resistance fades. The old identity's argument for waiting will sound like wisdom right up until the 48 hours have passed and the default consolidation has completed. The new identity doesn't need you to feel ready. It needs you to take the 4 actions from wherever you are right now, before the feeling of readiness arrives, which it may not, and before the argument for waiting sounds like anything other than the pendulum seeking its return position. The old operating system is familiar. It has years of evidence behind it, and it runs without any effort at all. The new one is available right now, in this specific window, at this specific depth of plasticity that the convergence of this week created. Both are available to you at this exact moment. What you do in the next hour determines which one becomes the ground you are standing on when you wake up tomorrow. And 3 weeks from now, when the memory of this threshold has faded, and what remains is either the new architecture or the old one, with a memory of when it almost changed. If you stayed until the end of this video, write in the comments, "I anchor the new." I've placed another video on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.